God Save the King.
Good place to start.
It was a good place to start. Well, you were conducting, and I was in the audience for this quite incredible concert you did in Ely Cathedral with possibly the largest forces I've ever seen in a cathedral. You conducting it and everything. Tell me about the whole project and how it came about, Paul.
Well, yes, I suppose the real question is why it took about 25 years, because as many of the Gramophone readers will know, I first made my name as a young conductor doing a project called Venetian Coronation.
Indeed.
Which I've sort of both extremely proud of and also sort of slightly cursed, because it's something which will probably be put on my tombstone. This project, which was recreating a 16th century Venetian coronation, went round the world. We've done it in many cathedrals, and we even re-recorded it about 20 years later. And it won another Gramophone award. So coronations are a big thing in my life. So the question is, why did it take us so long to get together and do an English equivalent? And it's a project which has been at the back of my mind for many, many years. The simple answer is because there's been so many other things to do, and one doesn't only want to do reconstructions and coronations. But the 20th century in England witnessed four of the greatest ceremonial occasions, certainly in the history of Britain, probably in the history of the world. So to some degree, it was a gift to try and combine all this amazing music, some of which is very well known, like Parry's I Was Glad and Handel's Zadok the Priest, but a lot of which is not so well known, and put it into one of McCreesh's special sort of imaginative recreations of an event, and that's what we did. One of the reasons it took some time is because, unlike the Venetian coronation, where you can do a spectacular project with 40 people, this needed getting on for 500 professional musicians. So it was a huge project, and one of the reasons that we did it was to incorporate a lot of our brilliant young singers that we work with from many choirs in the state schools of the UK, and we call that project Gabrieli Raw. And somehow or other we managed to bring the whole thing together in July in the amazing surroundings of Ely Cathedral, and at last we made it happen. I do think Ely is one of the great buildings. It uplifts the soul when you walk in, and I think that's very much part of the experience, not just for the audience, but especially for our young people. Many of them are not used to performing in any major building, and it really uplifts their soul, I think, when they walk into this amazing building, which moves you so much emotionally. It's quite
I
extraordinary.
wondered, though, because it's got a big acoustic, does that cause any problems when you're recording?
Of course, but I
So
mean, you know,
what sort of considerations do you have to make for that?
yes, I mean, but I think the acoustic is part of the music, isn't it?
Yes.
And you know, likewise, this was a problem in the coronations in Westminster Abbey. I mean, you know, I'm sure it's not easy for James O'Donnell either when you do those big occasions. In the coronations, they had 3 subconductors because the forces were so big they couldn't actually see the main conductor. But it is somehow it's the right acoustic for that sort of music. Gabrieli's is a wonderful vehicle for attracting musicians who have things to say, you know, and it doesn't matter whether I'm working in Purcell with Ollie Webber, you know, my principal second violin, talking about using proper historical stringing, or Catherine Martin leading the orchestra and using French bowholds, which is something that no other English group has ever tried to do. Or we go to the other end of the spectrum and I conduct a major orchestra, sometimes in conjunction with my Polish National Forum of Music friends, and we record Beale's Grand West Moor or Elijah, or these huge, you know, mega works of the 19th century. We do try and make sure we have the right musicians. And the other great thing about Gabrieli's is, although I don't think anybody in the business would accuse me of lacking musical personality, I do listen to other musicians. Gabrieli is the sum of its parts. If you have people like that, or Nicholas Daniel playing oboe in the ensemble, for example, you know, you have recourse to some of the great musical minds, and it's great to put their input into the mix. That I think is what's really great about Gabrieli's as a concept. And I can't tell you honestly whether the next recording will be Mortalis or whether it will be Gurulida. It could be either. But the point is that there are always, perhaps if I have skill, it's making sure we have the right people to make those.
But that's a big development from what your original conception was, you know, so wonderful, great.
I think, yeah, but I mean, I think there are 2 types of musicians. There are those who wish to be specialists and concentrate on basically one repertoire. So you can look at somebody like Peter Phillips and the Tallis Scholars, which is a wonderful group, but does basically one thing extremely well. Occasionally does little 20th century stuff, but it is a choir. Or you have people like me, or one or two other conductors, where you have a concept of how you make music, and it's how you think about the process of developing music, which actually applies to everything we do. And my approach is really no different when I'm working in 20th century repertoire or I'm working in 16th century repertoire. It's about how you get under the skin of the music, how we use historical information as part of the package of resources, if you like, in the interpretive arsenal, which is a very pretentious way of putting it. But I don't think we can ever be accused of being academic. We are both one of the most tough groups from a scholarly perspective, but also, I hope, one of the freest.
Now let's talk a bit about this specific recording and how you ever chose the repertoire, because there's so much to choose from. You've got 4 coronations, as you say, and we can only hear just a tiny little bit on this CD. At least we only got a little bit in the concert that I attended.
Yes, well, the concert, we did selected highlights. You've got 4 coronations, and I think it's fair to say that probably 60 or 70% of the music of all of those composite coronations is really first-class music.
But, for me, the great discovery was that the Stanford Gloria in B flat, and why nobody knows that, I do not know.
That is a fantastic piece.
It's a wonderful piece.
And it is done very occasionally liturgically, but not often.
No.
And it's also amazingly beautifully orchestrated. The middle section, which is pure Brahms, absolutely wonderful. I think one of the things that is really exciting about this project is that even music that you think you know well, Parry, I Was Glad, Zadok the Priest, these are pieces that turn up at evensong or major state occasions quite frequently, but you don't often have the luxury of hearing them with a full orchestra, massed trumpets, and a huge choir. And this is big choir music.
We should just say, do you know how many people there were in the choir and the orchestra, apart from the 20 people you had halfway down the nave?
Well, in the coronations, all the choirs were nearly 400 strong. We didn't quite get to 400, we were at 300 and something. And that included about 200 choir boys in each choir. And we have, the great thing about the coronations is we have an incredible amount of documentation.
Yeah.
So, for example, I can give you the list of every single performer who performed in every single coronation, which is fascinating because when we come to develop the orchestra, we know the type of instruments they played, we know the particular personalities of the players, we can listen to some of their work on historic recordings. So, compared to working in the 16th century where there is so much to guess, there's almost an embarrassment of riches in information.
Yes. And then the other big work you did, which again is not heard that often, is the Walton Te Deum, which is a big piece.
It's a great piece. I think it's one of his finest works in the sense that it's...
But nobody really knows it outside that coronation service.
And
why?
It's great ceremonial music. And Walton himself, obviously loved the commission. You know the quotation. He said, I'm rather enjoying writing this. It's going to be parts for the Queen's trumpeters and the Queen's side drummers, and lots of choir boys and countertenors, holy, holying. There's also another quote, which I never dare put in programmes, but he also says in the letter, he said, I'm having a little trouble abhorring the Virgin's womb. You better be careful not to tell the Archbishop. So I think is a lovely little, very sort of English humour.
Yes.
The actual CD will be a double album, and it will be really quite a huge experience. The coronations were nearly 3 hours long, so even on 2 CDs we have to slightly cut. You will hear all the music, which includes some preparatory music as
music
people
before?
came in.
Oh, really?
You'll hear a regalia procession, which preceded the arrival of the King and the Queen.
Yeah.
You'll then hear the Tallis Litany, which was a beautiful piece, which was sung before the coronation. You then, of course, go into I Was Glad and through the whole sequence. You get a whole series of homage anthems. So it's a very full reconstruction, and also you will hear a lot of processions, many of the prayers that were said, because it does link the whole thing together. And when you hear Zadok the Priest, and you realise that the prayers that the Archbishop of Canterbury says beforehand and afterwards both refer to Zadok, you really get this feeling of the whole thing being a great theatrical sort of operatic experience. It's all connected.
We should say that our narrator and Archbishop of Canterbury is
Well, we're delighted that we've managed to get Simon Russell Beale to put on false holy orders for the purpose of this of this recording, and he will be reading the part of the bishop. The Archbishop, of Canterbury, actually is virtually the only person who speaks in the whole of the coronation service. Even the king only says about 20 words, so it's quite interesting how...
In the concert, he was also narrating. Is that going to be kept on the CD?
No, the narration was developed for the concert.
For the concert, yeah.
But it will actually, it has no place in the actual CD.
He prayed absolutely beautifully. But then, so what are you going to, what other stuff besides you've got to as far as the crowning, and then you get the exit music and...
Yes, you'll get the recessional music. We also didn't talk about this fantastic piece that we've commissioned from David Matthews, which is right at the end of the coronation when the king is taken to Edward's Chapel to re-robe for the final grand recession rather than procession. And at that moment, traditionally, the organ would improvise, often on well-known English themes, hymn tunes, Jerusalem, whatever, even sometimes some folk tunes. So we thought we'd take that idea and ask him to write a prelude, which he's done, in a sort of slightly meditative, slightly rhapsodic style, again, incorporating some of these melodies. I'm absolutely thrilled with what he's come up with. I think it's absolutely perfect. He's totally understood the brief, and that leads us into a new setting of the national anthem, which is completely crazy, really fantastically exciting. And actually, I sort of noticed, because the second verse we invite the congregation to join, so we have nearly 1,000 performers on that particular track. And there is something quite wonderful as a conductor, just marshalling that sort of great paean, that sort of great cacophony of praise. It's a really wonderful moment. So I'm very, very glad we did that. So, and also looking at coronation music, it's a constantly changing phenomenon. You know, we know that a particular composer is preparing a piece for the next coronation.
Yeah.
And as it should be, you know, it's a constantly refreshing repertoire, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
I should have said you have this wonderful soprano for the Stanford, Rowan Pierce, who I'd never heard before, rather good. But what about the choirs? The choirs with your Gabrieli Raw. How much time did they have to learn these pieces, and how did you get them all together? Because they were difficult pieces for children to sing.
Very difficult. And it's very nice you mentioned Rowan Pierce, because Rowan is as we're all about to learn, having a very successful career as a young singer.
Yeah.
And she's now, I suspect, although one's never allowed to talk about a lady's age, I guess she's probably late 20s. But I first met her about 10 years ago when she was 16 or 17. And she was one of the singers that sang in one of the early projects for Gabrieli Raw. And so there's a very nice connection.
That's lovely,
there.
Yeah.
Now, Gabrieli Raw, what is Gabrieli Raw? It's not really an education project, because I think it's actually much more central to the work that we do. Gabrieli Raw is about challenging young people to connect absolutely directly with core culture. So we have many choirs from all over the UK, and they are of very different complexions. But the one thing that unites them is that their choir masters are really serious about pushing young people to connect with this music. And when you actually look at Raw as a choir, which makes me very, very pleased, is it looks like 200 kids that you would see on a market in an average town. So you will see people of all colour, of all sizes, of all shapes, it's a real mixed community. And that's a wonderful thing, that everybody is sharing this fantastic British heritage, which is all too often, you know, inevitably can be viewed only as a sort of upper class or middle class area. And I think that's a wonderful thing.